again, it's Al Hepburn back with part 3 of my video on continuous descent on final approach. Today we're going to be discussing unusual approaches. RNAV approaches with advisory vertical guidance have virtually become the standard non-precision approach in Canada. Traditional aids approaches are sufficiently rare that they can be called unusual. Just because they use traditional aids doesn't mean that they're not subject to CDFA, and indeed many have a CDFA table. We'll discuss these first, though with one exception, which I'll talk about towards the end of this part. You may never have to fly a traditional aids approach other than an ILS again. Then I'll discuss that question of what to do if you have to circle and no circling minimums are published. The remainder of this part will look at procedures with a blank or non-existent CDFA table. So far, we've discussed using CDFA techniques to fly straight-in non-precision RNAV approaches, where the slope height is documented in the CDFA table on the Canadian Instrument Approach Chart. We noted that, at least in Ontario, every airport with an IFR approach has an RNAV approach. In fact, every instrument runway in Ontario has an RNAV approach. In most cases, you will have advisory vertical guidance driving the vertical deviation indicator on your primary flight display. So it's a lot like flying an ILS. CDFA data is published for traditional aids approaches that meet NavCanada's criteria, but under normal conditions, these approaches are basically relics of the past. The first reason you might want to fly a traditional aids approach is that it's the only one that will work. As an example, and it may be unique, I'll discuss the localizer to runway 26 at Toronto's Billy Bishop. We'll look at it towards the end of this part of the video. The second reason, and I don't believe this has ever happened in the history of GPS, is during a prolonged GPS outage. Here are the possible reasons for loss of GPS. Onboard equipment failure. If this happens, you presumably only will have one GPS navigator and are arguably not compliant with the CARS. The operator has pretty good control over onboard sources of interference. Turn off cell phones and tracking devices. External jamming. Check your GPS NOTAMs. The source of un-NOTAM jamming is typically local. Diverting to your alternate will usually fix this problem. So that leaves loss of the GPS system. If you lose GPS, you're facing an emergency and have to get somewhere where you can see the ground. The dive and drive versus continuous descent decision is the least of your problems. The immediately obvious solution is to fly a traditional aids approach, but the sparsity of traditional aids in the aftermath of NavCanada's NavAid modernization plan is such that this may not be practical. In the populous southern strip of Canada, dead reckoning to an ILS site where you can get a vectored ILS is probably your best bet. Otherwise, you have a few VOR approaches, 4 in Ontario, which you may be able to fly. If you have an ADF, that adds 14 possible recovery sites. DME adds another 6. Failing that, you're stuck with navigating to an area of known VMC by dead reckoning. You'd think the airlines might be worried about this situation, but they have a backup RNAV system that isn't available to the rest of us. DME inertial. Their flight management system can tune multiple DME stations rapidly to get their position, and inertial nav fills in the gaps. That, by the way, is why VORs have disappeared, but the associated DME sites are still up and running. For the rest of us, loss of GPS is a low probability risk you have to accept if you want to fly little airplanes in Canada in IMC in the 21st century. The traditional aids approach charts include a CDFA table, but since, with the rare exception of a traditional aids approach being the only one available, you will be flying the approach due to loss of GPS, the stabilized versus dive and drive decision will be the least of your worries. It makes you wonder why they bother with CDFA data for these approaches. Perhaps it's a hangover from the days when they were more numerous. If, for whatever reason, you like to fly a traditional aids approach with /DME in the title, like this VOR DME09 approach at Gatineau, note that the reference datum for slope data is typically the DME site, not the runway threshold. Also, there will be no advisory vertical guidance on any traditional aids approach, with or without GPS. For a VOR, localizer, or ILS approach, your lateral guidance must be taken from the VHF aid, so you will push CDI to show VLOC. At that point, the GPS map page may be your only source of distance information. If so, you'll need to find something other than the GPS terrain page as a source of GSL. Now let's look at what to do if you find yourself flying to a runway with an approach from only one end, but the wind favouring landing from the other end. In most cases, circling minimums have been eliminated from straight-in RNAV procedures in Canada. Brampton is one of only 2 airports in Ontario where you encounter this situation, because the real estate to the south is occupied by the approaches to Toronto International. The other is my home field of Pembroke, where the restricted airspace to the north precludes an approach to runway 17. Both airports have traditional aids approaches to the one instrument runway, and these procedures do have circling minimums. At Burlington Air Park, which is to the south of Toronto's approaches, the only approach is an RNAV from the south, but in this case, circling minimums are published. At Burlington, there is no traditional aids approach. The solution seems simple. Publish circling minimums for Brampton RNAV 14 and Pembroke RNAV 35. In the meantime, I'll use the circling minimums for the traditional aids approach, which also starts overhead the airport, headed in basically the same direction. I've asked NavCanada this question, but have received no reply. The other bizarre feature at Brampton, by the way, is that the circling minimums for the VOR DME are 100 feet lower than the straight-in minimums for the RNAV approach. Now we'll look at approaches where the CDFA table is either blank or non-existent. The first 3 reasons for that are pretty obvious. If you're flying an ILS or an RNAV approach to LPV minimums, you will have approved vertical guidance, so there's no need for CDFA information. If only circling minimums are published, the final approach will be visual, so CDFA information is not applicable. They don't have a CDFA table on US charts, but it's still nice to have the benefits of a stabilized approach. In all 3 of these cases, continuous descent techniques can still be beneficial. I'll discuss them later. That leaves us with those straight-in approaches for which NavCanada leaves the CDFA table blank, because the approach simply doesn't meet their criteria. Back in part 1, we saw that one of these criteria was that the slope is steeper than 3.5 degrees, or 370 feet per mile. But there are apparently other criteria that are not so easy to determine. There's nothing in the instrument rating flight test guide that says you only apply CDFA when the table is available. And just because the table is blank, don't give up on advisory vertical guidance. We'll look now at how you might handle these straight-in Canadian approaches with a blank table. Here's the RNAV 2-3 approach at Bromont, Quebec. The CDFA table is blank. If there's a step-down fix, it's there because of some obstruction, probably that 602-foot lighted tower. The step-down fix usually sets the gradient. We'll calculate the gradient in feet per mile based on the 425-foot threshold crossing height, minimums at Zovpu of 1,000 feet, and the distance between Zovpu and the runway of 1.5 miles. It works out at 383 feet per mile. That's above the 370 feet per mile limit established by NavCanada, so that's why the table is blank. I tried loading this approach in the air recently, and it said I'd get advisory vertical guidance. The advisory slope is probably determined this way. At least that's how it seems to be done in the States, and advisory vertical guidance is a Garmin-Jeppesen invention. We still need to populate the table approximately. I'll use the next steeper easy math gradient of 400 feet per mile. The slope height at the FAF would be 5 times 400 plus 425, or 2425 feet. The slope at Elvis, 6 miles outside the FAF, would be 2,400 feet higher, or 4825. So, since the MSA is 5,000 feet, we're looking at a 2-stage descent. If we can make a top of descent 2 miles back from the FAF, it will be 800 feet above the FAF height, or 3225. We'd have 1,800 feet to lose. Can we do that? In 5 miles, it might be a bit tight. We have lots of room after turning final. So move the top of descent back a mile to 3,600 feet and 8 miles. That makes the initial descent less aggressive. Since we used the 1,000-foot minimum at Zovpu to calculate our final descent gradient, we can expect to cross Zovpu at close to 1,000 feet. Here's the RNAV 3-4 at Marathon, Ontario. Again, the CDFA table is blank, and it looks like a repeat of the last slide. But when we do the calculations based on lev-up, we find it's only 340 feet per mile, and for Kebla it's even shallower, so it must not meet some other unknown criterion. Loading this one on my aircraft, it again said we'd get advisory vertical guidance. Let's look at populating the table. Normally I'd use the next steeper easy math gradient for this, but in this case we're only looking at 7 feet per mile difference, so I'll use 3 miles per 1,000 feet. The FAF crossing altitude works out at 2,450, well above minimums. A 6-mile top of descent will put us 1.9 miles back from the FAF, which is just about ideal. At 6 miles, the slope height is 3,100 feet, right on the minimum safe altitude, so we'd have a single-stage descent. So we'll go with 3,100 feet at 6 miles. Since we used the 1,760-foot minimums at lev-up to calculate the slope gradient, we can expect to cross lev-up at 1,760 feet. If we're getting advisory vertical guidance, we may need just a touch of back pressure to stay above minimums there. ILS and LPV approaches are approaches with vertical guidance. Here for runway 21 at Maniwaki, it's 3.6 degrees. This approach has both LNAV and LPV lines of minimums, so as long as the WAS integrity is met, you will have approved not just advisory vertical guidance to the LPV decision height. The gradient for the LPV approach is shown at the side of the profile view, and in the case of an ILS, above the glide slope symbol. But because that slope exceeds the limit for RNAV data, the CDF table is blank. The method I've been describing can still be useful to pick your top of descent height, either for ILS or LPV. Here at Maniwaki, you won't be vectored to final at an assigned altitude. After you're cleared for the approach, you'll be on your own. Using the next steeper easy math slope above 3.6 degrees, I'll use 400 feet per mile, 3.8 degrees, to work out my top of descent. The 2 mile distance would be 5.9 miles, giving a descent of 6 times 400 or 2,400 feet. Adding the threshold clearance height of about 600 feet gives a top of descent of 3,000 feet at 6 miles. I'll extend that to 3,400 feet and 7 miles to get a single stage descent. That fairly steep descent will require an inch or so less manifold pressure than a standard rate descent. In a radar environment, you'll intercept final at a barometric altitude assigned by the controller. Some controllers are inclined to vector you very close or even above the glide slope on an ILS. So make sure you have the vertical deviation indicator in view before you intercept the final approach course. This approach is typical of many in the mountains. Although it's aligned with the runway, the descent would be just too steep for IMC. A quick look at the leg from the step-down fix of Picton to the runway shows that we need to lose 3,300 feet in 4 miles to land straight in. That's 825 feet per mile. Too steep for IMC. That's why it's a circling approach. But we can still use continuous techniques to get to circling minimums. To get down fairly quickly after Picton, let's work with a slope of 400 feet per mile. If we cross Picton right on the 4,500 foot minimum at 400 feet per mile descent, the height loss between Picton and the MDA is 4,500 minus 3,240, about 1,300 feet. At 400 feet per mile, that will take 3.3 miles. So we'd be visual at circling minimums a bit under a mile back from the airport. This slope would cross Rotka 800 feet above the 4,500 step-down minimum at Picton, so that would be 5,300. That's right on minimums. The minimum height at which a transition lets us join final is 6,500, so our top of descent has to be 1,200 higher, or another 3 miles back. So if we use a top of descent of 6,500 feet, 3 miles back from Rotka, we'll have a continuous descent to circling minimums about a mile before the runway. The next 3 slides are intended to show you some of the differences when using US charts for descent planning. They are certainly not intended as a comprehensive guide to flying RNAV procedures south of the border. In the US, there's never a CDFA table. You'll usually get vertical guidance, advisory, or approved. If it's an LPV, like the RNAV approach to runway 23 at Saranac Lake here, the gradient is shown beside the profile view, much like in Canada. Here it's 3.2 degrees. In a radar environment, you will usually intercept the final approach course on a vector at an assigned altitude, then follow the needle down. Outside of radar coverage, you can use the way we previously discussed to pick your top of descent. Here, the lowest transition altitude is 5,500 feet. Where will that intercept the glide path? We have about 3,800 feet to lose, so using our closest easy math gradient of 1,000 feet per 3 miles, that will require 11.4 miles. The FAF is at 6.1 miles, so 5.3 miles before the FAF. The 3.2 degree slope will be a little later. So our top of descent is 5,500 feet, soon after John. Do your checks during the transition. When there's no LPV line of minimums, the vertical descent angle, or VDA, may be shown. If it is, it will be placed, quote, following the fix on which it is based, unquote, as shown here for the RNAV runway 09 approach at Saranac Lake. That might have been the step-down fix, but not here. If there is advisory vertical guidance, it will match this slope. Again, the only thing we need to work out is our top of descent. At 3 miles per 1,000 feet, that's 9.6 miles, which puts us 2.1 miles inside RNNDY, which is at 11.7 miles. Not as tight as the last one, though in this case the 3-degree intercept will be a little earlier. When the vertical descent angle is not specified, it means that, quote, the prescribed obstacle clearance is not clear and the visual descent angle must not be used below the minimum descent altitude, unquote. Using the absence of information to convey information is kind of cryptic, but there's also a note about obstacles in the visual segment above the profile view. I wonder if this is perhaps also one of NavCanada's criteria for leaving the CDFA table blank. Anyway, so much for the visual portion. What do we do above the MDA? We have to see which fix sets the slope. In this example, the RNAV approach to runway 23 at Messina, New York. When we do the math, it's neckic, and the slope will be right on 320 feet per mile, or 3 degrees. You can use the easy math 3.1 degree approximation to populate the table. The FAF crossing height, 5.1 miles, works out at 1970 feet. To see whether a single stage descent will be possible, you will need the height at the initial approach fix, Salis, which is 6 miles further out. 6 miles is 2,000 feet, so the slope height there will be 3970. In the US, they often use a holding pattern as a transition. It can also serve to execute a course reversal. The navigator will give you the option of flying the hold. Here, inbound from the east at the minimum safe altitude of 3,700 feet, you could simply turn onto the final approach course, since you'd be 300 feet below the slope. Inbound from the west, you'd want to use the hold as a course reversal and could make your top of descent anything between 3,700 and the minimum holding altitude of 2,500 feet. Oh, and once you reach the visual segment, you have been warned. Here's that one exception that I mentioned in the introduction. The localizer approach to runway 26 at Toronto's Billy Bishop Airport. NavCanada denies they had anything to do with its design. When I first put this video together, this was the only unrestricted approach from the east to one of Canada's busiest runways. Just recently, the RNAV Zulu approach to 26 was republished after a brief absence. But it's offset about 15 degrees from the runway center line, and the minimums are 500 feet higher than the localizer. So when the ceiling is low, this localizer approach may still be your only option. It's not clear, by the way, why the localizer procedure is not a locked DME, since all the fixes are defined by DME. The CDFA table is blank. It's easy to see why. The threshold clearance height is around 300 feet, and there's a step-down fix from 1220 at 2.3 miles. So, 920 feet in 2.3 miles. That works out at exactly 400 feet per mile, well over NavCanada's 3.5 degree criterion. The problem is a stack that towers to 952 feet at the east end of the harbour. Even 400 feet per mile clears the stack by only 300 feet. That leaves me feeling uncomfortable, so I'll opt for the even steeper 500 foot per mile gradient. At Zydek, the slope height will be 300 plus 500 times 2.3 or 1450 GSL. At Rabex, the FAF, the slope height will be 300 plus 500 times 3.3 or 1950 GSL. ATC will typically assign you a top of descent of 3,000 feet barometric. That'd be 5.4 miles in standard conditions. But what if they're non-standard? When do you start down? For sure, you'll have no vertical guidance, advisory or otherwise. So check your GSL and delay your descent by 0.2 of a mile for each 100 feet below the 3,000 GSL. Then check your GSL against these calculated heights at Rabex and Zydek. Oh, and by the way, you'd better get to the MDA in time because no circling minimums are published. These steep approaches can be flown in IMC, at least in my airplane, but do practice them in VMC before you try it in weather. A stabilized approach is certainly preferable to dive and drive when the transitions are this close to the obstruction. It's pretty clear that knowing your distance to the next waypoint and or distance to run is vital when flying this approach. Yet, on final, your CDI is supposed to be driven by VLOC. At that point, unless you've got DME, your only source of distance information will be the map page on your GPS navigator. So you won't want to leave that map page unless you have an alternative way of displaying your distance to the next waypoint that still uses GPS as its source. If you haven't, you'll need a way of determining GSL other than the terrain page on GPS number 1. Another little quirk on this approach is that the localizer frequency is the same as the frequency for the ILS on runway 08. So do check the Morse code identifier to make sure you have the correct nav aid selected. There is one other way to skin this cat. I spoke to a corporate pilot who says they accept clearance for the localizer approach, then fly the restricted RNAV procedure, even though they're not approved to do so. That gives them vertical GPS guidance to an NDA 150 feet below the localizer approach, but they're still within 300 feet of the stack. The two approaches look the same on a radar screen, so nobody knows. If you do go for this option, the 3,000 foot top of descent will be 6.7 miles. Your choice, I guess. In closing, here are some suggestions about flying the missed approach with the GPS navigator. When you're flying CDFA, you're required to go missed when you reach your minimum descent altitude. When you make the decision to go missed, most autopilots advise you to switch them off briefly. This is particularly important if you're doing a coupled descent, as it could take you below minimums. Some of the new autopilots have a takeoff go-around toga button, which commands a pitch up and wings level. All you have to do is add power, but you still have to return to GPS guidance. This example is the ILS 08 at North Bay, so you'll be in VLOC mode. As soon as possible after initiating the missed approach, switch the CDI to GPS, as the localizer guidance gets erratic after the missed approach point. Once you're established in the climb, you can turn the autopilot back on in nav mode. Waypoint sequencing will be suspended at the missed approach point, but the GPS will continue guiding you down the center line. This suspend feature does not apply to the 600-700 with a Toga autopilot. At this point, there's a marked difference between the 400-500 series and the 600-700. Note the flight plans. On the 600-700 at the right, there's an extra heading 077 to 2700 leg after runway 08. That's because it's able to fly heading to altitude legs. The 400-500 can't do that. You have to manage the climb straight ahead to 2700 manually. On the 600-700, you can unsuspend by pressing OBS as soon as sequencing is suspended. On the 400-500, you keep it in suspend until you reach 2700. Then you press OBS, the leg to YYB becomes active, and it starts an immediate turn towards the missed approach holding fix. I hope you've learned something from this discussion of continuous descent on final approach. Before it was introduced, I was flying a sort of modified dive and drive, where the rate of dive was related to the distance I had to get down to the next step down fix. But it was by no means a stabilized descent. Now I'm firmly convinced that CDFA is the way to go. I can't imagine being comfortable flying that localizer 2.6 at Billy Bishop if I was starting a dive on a 3-mile final from 1500 feet with a 952 foot stack a mile ahead. The other lesson I'd like you to take away is the advantage of using GSL as your altitude reference. Correcting the barometric altimeter in cold weather is just too much work. In fact, I suspect most of us simply haven't been going to the trouble of making the correction, in which case using GSL is much safer. Until the next time, blue skies and tailwinds.